Go over to Hallie Jackson, because the question of where the Republican Party stands right now is a fascinating one. And it's going to come to a head pretty soon in Congress, in the Senate, where an impeachment trial is about to be held as well. Talk about, first of all, Vice President Mike Pence, who had been the staunchest and most loyal to the very end with President Trump until the Capitol insurrection, where his own life was threatened. And now you see that distance. And it's so notable today, Hallie, that Vice President Pence is going to attend the inauguration and not President Trump's goodbye party at Andrews Air Force Base, Joint Base Andrews. So talk about where the Republican Party is and where it goes from here.
So, Savannah, that's exactly the thread that I was thinking about as you and Chuck were having that conversation about Vice President Pence. Typically, right, at any of the other moments in the 4 years that I've been covering President Donald Trump, you would see the vice president at his side. He is not going to be. In fact, it's Mike Pence who's going to be conducting what we often think of as the trappings of the presidency as it relates to what you described as the changing of the guard, is the handoff there. It is the vice president who will be attending the inauguration. It is the vice president who has been stepping into that role in the absence, frankly, of President Trump's desire to do that. So that is one of the things that we're going to be watching today, those dynamics and how it plays out. The relationship between those two leaders, Savannah, between the president and vice president, according to my sources, is just broken. It is not like it was. It is not ever going to be like it was again. As the vice president departs, the White House staffers depart as well. As we take a look at the South Lawn here, and just to give folks a perspective, we have seen President Trump do this walk about 1 billion times through the course of his presidency from a different vantage point. This is often where he stops and talks to reporters before getting on Marine One. You hear that chopper noise in the background. It's unlikely he'll stop and talk today. He might. You can see the people on the left side of your screen. Those are members of the pool, other reporters waiting to hear from the president. But you look ahead at what's next. He will be in Mar-a-Lago, but this impeachment trial that you referenced will be happening in the Senate. And this is going to be a test for many Republicans. It's going to take 17 Republicans to basically cross the aisle and vote with Democrats to convict President Trump. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, the Senate Republican leader, has all but given permission tacitly for Republicans to do that by saying he himself, and publicly saying in ways that have been communicated to the media, that he is open one way or the other. He is not ruling out a potential conviction. We're not just talking about people like, Senator Mitt Romney, right? Senator Susan Collins, people who have been considered in kind of that never Trump camp or Trump skeptical camp that have often come out and expressed their concern or disappointment with the president. We're talking about the potential for many more Republicans. In fact, Mitch McConnell is the one who is able to open the door for that once this trial begins. And the state of the Republican Party, that's the short-term piece of it, right? But you look at the medium and the longer-term piece. There is a reckoning that is already happening about how this party either comes together or doesn't in the post-Trump era, which is beginning in just about 4 hours from now. Because you have to remember, while President Trump has dismayed, disappointed, infuriated some conservatives here in Washington and many Republicans around the country, particularly with the way he incited that insurrection at the Capitol just here a couple of weeks ago, he still does have a hardcore base of loyal supporters. And there will be, and there are right now, some Republicans who are hoping to tap into that. You look at the actions of, for example, Senator Josh Hawley over the last couple of weeks, the things that he has done, the things he has previewed that he will do as it relates to this impeachment trial, somebody who seems to be looking to take the mantle of the Trump presidency, Savannah, as we see the president walk out.
Let's watch these pictures. The president and first lady in their final steps outside the White House residence, walking over to the assembled. And we may perhaps hear from him, but that will be something we'll have to play back. We don't have a live picture of that. And I bring Peter Alexander into this conversation. I know you're watching with me, and you, as White House correspondent, have seen many, many of these departures from the South Lawn. And they, even though it's somewhat routine, it usually does draw a crowd. We don't see that huge crowd of staff today. But let's just take a moment and watch these final moments of President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump as they board Marine One, headed home to Florida. We do know now what the president just said to the crowd. He said it has been a great honor and an amazing 4 years. Those were his words just a moment ago. We'll turn the tape around as soon as we can get it. But right now, we will watch Marine One as it departs. It's a short ride to Joint Base Andrews, just outside of Washington. And that's where Air Force One is pre-positioned, ready to take the president and the First Lady to Mar-a-Lago, where the president will live for the foreseeable future. And there it is, shot of Air Force One. The final time that the president will ride in Air Force One in his 4-year term.
Yeah, and at the air base, we do see some well-wishers and fans. We know that Vice President Pence will not be there. He said he could not do the inauguration as well as this farewell event. So it'll be interesting to see who is there when President Trump arrives. Again, he's president until noon today. It is not as if this moment marks the end of anything. It is after the inauguration at noontime that President Trump will no longer be president of the United States.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this is a scene we have seen many times before, but not at this moment, not in the morning. And here's some of the tape playback of the president giving that final wave just into our newsroom. So we're showing that final wave from a different vantage point, but he is now, the picture on your left is a live picture where Marine One is about to depart. But normally this all would take place after the inauguration, after a shaking of hands, after a tea, after a ceremonial walk. None of that is happening today. The president has chosen to leave town early, head to this celebration at Joint Base Andrews, and then head off to Florida. Peter, let me bring you into this because, you know, these final days at the White House, I know have been extraordinary. They always are. But there's been a real emptying out. We've seen resignations of cabinet secretaries, as Marine One rotors up here. Just a different feel in the closing days of this administration.
Yeah, Savannah, that's exactly right. I was in the West Wing briefly yesterday as members of the president's staff were clearing out their desks, some of them leaving notes behind for those that would succeed them. But notably, what we're looking at right now is something that would happen on the east front of the Capitol. This is something that would happen after the inauguration of a new president. This president, the first in 152 years, the first living president in 152 years, not to participate in that peaceful transfer of power at the Capitol, the inauguration process. Instead, the peaceful transfer of power this day, of course, is being guaranteed, secured by 25,000 National Guard troops who have secured just a massive perimeter around Washington. This is a stunning shot to see, a shot that we only have on extraordinary days like this, a live picture of the President of the United States boarding Marine One for a short trip to Joint Base Andrews. The president who has been photographed so many times, spoken to the cameras so many times from that position where the red carpet exits the South Portico at the White House, doing it for the final time on this day. And as we've been discussing, this president who had been eyeing 2024 with conversations early on that it might be on this day that he announced a 2024 presidential bid in some way to try to overshadow Joe Biden's victory, has in many ways been diminished by the events of the last several weeks, those Capitol riots, the president's incitement of many of his supporters to head there. As you watch Marine One pick up.
As we watch this, I'm struck because we have this wide vantage point of the White House and the whole complex that if you look to the top left of your screen and if you were to see the street right across is Blair House. And Blair House is where the president-elect Joe Biden spent the evening and is right now. And that is as close as the outgoing president and the incoming president will come today. This picture you see right there. The outgoing President Trump aboard Marine One, it's taking off, about to lift up over the White House. We'll pass over Blair House, where the incoming president waits to take the oath of office afternoon today.
Yes, and
Savannah, for clarity, early today we heard from members of Joe Biden's team that there has been no direct contact between President Trump and President-elect Biden. Of course, none, as you note, will happen face-to-face, and there has been no call of any kind, in spite, as we were told, allies and advisors of the president urging him to do just that.
how long is this ride, Savannah?
It's just a few minutes, 5-10 minutes.
Yeah.
It's the Joint Base Andrews is just a few minutes outside of Washington, and that's the quickest way to get there.
Yeah.
Marine One, and it also affords that ride affords an incredible and beautiful view of the nation's capital and all of its monuments. The United States Capitol, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson, the White House, the Washington Monument. He is flying over a city in lockdown whose mall is closed. Spectators, other than a handful, not allowed because of the security concerns and the attempted insurrection of 2 weeks ago. So you can imagine that's a beautiful shot, and what a view that really only a president gets.
And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what are Trump's final words going to be as president of the United States? And when he gets there, he will make some brief remarks, and we'll be curious to see what he says.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Find your favorite recipes, celebrity interviews, uplifting stories, shop our favorite deals, and so much more with the Today app. Download it now.